All right. Well, they asked me to talk about my testimony, and it has been a long time since I've done this. But I think it's important because I think of how often the Apostle Paul referred back to his conversion, and so even throughout all of his years, and it is the point at which my whole life changed. So. When I was 16 years old, I was already into a lot of things like drugs, mainly a lot of marijuana, a lot of hash. Don't even know if they have that anymore. A lot of LSD. And I was with some friends one night, and we had two friends actually. And one of them was driving. It was his mother's car. He was AWOL from the Marines, okay? And that night, I lived in Xenia, Ohio, and we drove off to Dayton, Ohio, about 35 miles east of Xenia. And we partied all night that night, and we also picked up a quantity of drugs of various kinds with the intention of selling it. And the next morning, we get back to Xenia, and it's early in the morning. We're all burnt out, heading back home. And all of a sudden, two police cruisers pull up, one in front of the car and one behind. Turns out that the guy that was driving the car, his mother had reported his car as stolen. Now, I'm not clear on whether she knew she was turning in her son or not, but they also realized that he was AWOL, so the Marines wanted him as well. Anyway, they haul him off, and then we're left, my other friend and I are left walking on the street back home. And we feel, wow, what a relief we didn't get caught. But that didn't last very long, because pretty soon they pull up to pick us up as well, because they found the drugs in the car. And so I got to spend, at 16 years old, a couple weeks in jail, and that was a turning point for me. That really scared me. And I remember while I was in there, and my family was not a religious family. We rarely went to church, and never as a family. Occasionally, Mom and Dad would send us off to church, just us kids, just to get us out of the house, I think. But I got on my knees and I prayed for the first time in my life. Nobody even told me how to do that or anything. And I remember telling the Lord that if I get out of this situation, that I want to give my life to Him. And just about the time I finished that prayer, I see two eyes. There was a little window in this iron door. There's a little window about 3 inches by 2 inches. There were these two eyes looking through. And then the door came open. He says, "Son, everything's going to be all right." And that's the first time I ever saw that man, and the last time I ever saw him. I think he was the janitor of the jail, the Greene County Jail. And as soon as I get home, the next day, I guess my name was in the paper, and so somebody called me. It was a girl. She called me and invited me to church. And I'll have to admit, I went to church originally for the girl, okay? But once I got there, I was just blown away by the atmosphere there and the love that these people had for each other. It was amazing. And you have to keep in mind that Xenia First Church of Christ was going through some real revival, and I attribute that somewhat. This is another story altogether. I don't know if I need to get into that, but we had a tornado in Xenia that wiped out almost the whole town. Xenia was one of the few churches that was not hit, and so it became a hub for doing community service. And I think that transformed that church. And there was just a lot of life in that church, a lot of love. It was the love that just grabbed my attention. And I realized that here I was involved with all this hippie things, and there was a lot of talk about love, but there was no real love there. I saw love in that church. And so I was baptized, And I remember they started giving me all these reading Francis Schaeffer. If you know anything about Francis Schaeffer, he's this Christian philosopher, reading C.S. Lewis. And I start sharing this stuff with my parole officer. And after a while, he says, "Don't come back. You don't need to come back anymore." And so then I lived for a while with the youth minister of that church, Don Toy, who discipled me and taught me. Every day we were talking about things related to the church, things related to the Bible. And one day he encouraged me to go to Bible college, and so I did, and studied at Cincinnati Bible College, it was called then, and then also went straight into Cincinnati Christian Seminary, and then went straight to the mission field, and was there for 21 years. Raised our family there, my wife and I, and that's my story. And so I still remember that. And there was a time when I wanted to kind of get out of the whole missions thing and change. I was kind of looking into maybe getting into some secular work of some sort, but the Lord has pulled me right back to the same thing, teaching the Bible, and that's where I feel gifted, and that's where I feel comfortable, and that's what I'm doing. There is a mistake in there. It's actually, I think it's a probation officer. I said parole officer. Probation officer.
Yes. Correction there. Mm-hmm. Alrighty. Well, what is up, everybody? Welcome to our hopefully now weekly deep dive podcast. If this is your first time tuning in, what we usually do on these podcasts is we use it as an opportunity to go a little bit deeper in the topics that we have been covering in our Sunday services and in our sermons. But over the last few weeks, we've started this new series we're calling Backstories, where we are still doing the deep dives. We're doing the deep dives on people's own life stories. Last week, we got to do Jacob Dooley's story, who is here with me.
Hey.
Yaakov, as he was listed there in his Hebrew transliteration. Jacob is our connections pastor here at Wayfarers, and it was really, really cool to hear his story. But today, you got to hear the quick version. But again, we're doing the deep dive. And we've got Greg Waddell here with us. Say hello to everybody, Greg.
Hey, everybody.
And then we've also got Ashley Wakefield, everybody's fan favorite.
Hello, how are you?
Mm-hmm.
And my name is Nick Griffin. I'm the lead pastor here at Wayfarers. So, like I said, we're doing the deep dive. We're going to dive right in, Greg. I loved hearing your story. I've known you for my whole life.
All your life.
You mentioned that you were on the mission field for 21 years, and it started in Uruguay, and then most of it later was in Argentina, correct?
Right.
And so my father was also a missionary with you on the mission field. And so it's one of those interesting things where when you grow up with somebody, when you're a kid, they know you from the time you're a kid. It is always so weird how it feels like there's two times you meet this person. You meet them when you grow up, but then it's later when you're an adult and you meet them as an adult, where I feel like you really start to get to know a lot more about them. And so it's been really cool to get to know you a little bit better here recently, especially, and to get to hear your story. I almost thought we should title this our drug dealer elder at the church here. Get it started, but ex-drug dealer.
And I just want to say, it's really amazing that you even shared that story, because I know a lot of people would feel uncomfortable sharing it, because I think people need to hear stuff like that because people are going through the same thing and they feel like that they can't be saved because of what they're going through. And so I commend you for sharing that, because it can be a hard thing to share because some people will receive it well and other people won't, depending on who they are. And so, yeah, so I just commend you for that, for even sharing it.
It is really, really cool to hear about, where you've come from. So I wanted to start first with those early parts of your life. Like you said, you mentioned that you had been getting into drugs and hanging out with people. How did that start? Was it just a group of friends? Was it, where did the influence get to pull you into that life?
That's kind of a good question, because usually people assume it was because you had a bad father or mother. It's not the case with me. I just had this streak in me, this rebellious streak. I don't know how to explain it as psychologically or anything like that. Some people say I got real bored with school easily. I don't know. I don't know about that. All I
Yeah.
know is that, well, one of the things was that we were on our own a lot because mom and dad both worked, you know. Those were the days when, you know, the parents would say, okay, out of the house, and I don't want to see you again until 5 o'clock.
Right. The story I've always heard is that you could go out, and your parents usually had the rule that once the street lights came on, you had to
Right.
be back in the house. So.
Yeah.
Was this in the 70s that you were
The
going?
70s.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so
Early 70s.
And so you had a little bit of a rebellious streak. I
Yeah.
thought that was interesting. So, because you mentioned that you didn't grow up necessarily in a Christian household.
No.
Do you think your parents would have identified as Christian if you'd
No,
asked them?
not at the time. They probably wouldn't even know what you were talking about.
Really? So, because that's interesting to me. You know, culture has changed a little bit, but I at least talked to other people who say in decades past, you would have had a lot of people who, if you asked them, they would have said, "Yeah, I'm a Christian," but they didn't go to church. Your parents were not that way. It sounds
Not
like.
that way. It's not that they were anti-Christian either.
Right.
They were good people.
Yeah.
But the only times that I remember going to church, as I said, were, you know, they would send us to a church there at the corner of where we used to live on a street called 2nd Street, and then there was another street that came diagonal to that, and then right on that corner was a Baptist missionary church.
Okay.
And the thing I remember most is the clown. They had some kind of not the preacher.
Not that clown.
Not that one. No, they had some kind of special thing for the kids, and a clown came in, and I remember that. And but my parents never went with us to those things. But here's an interesting thing. Years later, I was back on a furlough from the mission field, preaching at my home church there at the First Church of Christ in Xenia. And afterwards, this lady came up and says, "I cannot believe it. Do you remember me?" She was the lady that taught the Sunday school class that I went to in that little Baptist church on the corner.
On the corner.
Yeah.
And she'd come to see you preach.
Yeah.
Wow.
I guess. I think so. She might have been attending the church at that time. I'm not sure.
That is awesome. And so you didn't grow up with that Christian influence necessarily. You know, if anything, it was just to get you out of the house, go down to this corner church.
Right. Mom and Dad needed some alone time.
Right.
So were you all, did you all grow up like in a more independent environment? I guess because I'm just asking because, you know, it seemed like your parents would just, you know, go here and come back at this time, and they would just kind of give you the freedom to go on your own. So was it like more like independent?
Like how strict do you think they were?
Oh, they weren't. They weren't strict.
Hardly at all.
No.
Let you do kind of
I
whatever you
often
wanted to
thought that they needed to be more strict with me. They should have been more strict with me. Yeah.
So were they aware of some of the influences and friends and things that you were getting into that later on in your teenage years?
You know, that's interesting because, wow, I'm not sure how much they were aware of.
Yeah.
I mean, eventually they were, obviously, when the school started calling and saying, "Your son is on LSD here at the high school. You need to come and get him."
Right.
You know, stuff like that. But I'm sure it put him through a lot of, you know, misery, all of that.
But you don't remember them being...
I don't think they saw it developing.
Yeah. It was just one day all of a sudden you had all these issues. So, you know, the big moment that really caught me in your story especially was, you know, you talked about you'd gotten pulled over, you'd gotten arrested. Definitely, I'm sure not how you intended to end that night. And I thought I appreciated you talking about just how scared you were in that moment. And I was really impacted by the fact that you said that was kind of the first time you sat down and you prayed. As someone who hadn't grown up in a Christian household, do you have any idea why that was your first impulse? Did you believe in God, you feel like, already? You just weren't?
I don't remember ever thinking about God prior to that.
Yeah.
But I think there was just kind of I had an assumption in my heart that God existed, and so I cried out to him.
Yeah.
You know.
And then that moment's so powerful then later where you said you looked up and the little slot opens up and you just see these two eyes looking down at you.
Yeah, and I found out later that the guy is a Christian. He had been praying for me.
Wow.
Oh, that's nice.
And so just those words of affirmation to a scared child who was just
huge.
So worried and just saying it's
I was
gonna be
literally
all right.
on my knees, you know, it's not actually a bed,
Right.
but whatever you call that.
The bench, the cot.
The cot, that's the word. And looked up and saw those eyes in there, and then the door opens, and he said that. So
Yeah.
it's kind of...
So had you been to church prior to that incident happening?
Well, just those times that I mentioned.
kid.
As a even younger, way younger. By this time, I hadn't been to church for years.
And so, I love that after that, you said you got a phone call.
I got a phone call like this next day.
That's what was
That's
my question.
crazy.
How soon
Yeah.
after?
Like the next day.
Wow. And I love your honesty again. I was it was a girl, and I was like, yeah, sure, I'll go. I've heard that story many times from many different Christians. It's amazing how many times romantic interest will be the motivator that starts the the visit, and then it kind of goes from there. But I love
So
that.
never underestimate romantic interest.
It's a missionary dating is the thing I've heard of people
Missionary.
say all the time.
That's what I'm doing. I'm going to go out doing some evangelism.
And so that was your motivation. This girl invited you. You went to church. And I love that you said it was just the environment, the community from the people that really drew you in. You mentioned it briefly, and you said it's almost maybe a story for another time, but there had been a tornado recently, right?
Right.
What had gone on?
It was 1974, April of 1974. At that time, it was the largest tornado in American history. Of course,
Wow.
that's been surpassed since then. But it wiped out our town. I mean, I think almost every school in town was completely wiped out. Most of the church buildings, especially the old brick and mortar church buildings that were in the center of town, all destroyed. If it had occurred just 20 minutes earlier, it would have killed a lot more children because school let out like 20 minutes earlier than that.
Wow.
Entire neighborhoods were flattened, like one of them called Arrowwood, and just piles of mostly wood and debris. And the weirdest thing about that was when we were driving around through that, to hear telephones going off underneath these piles of debris.
People calling to see
How their family is.
Yeah, my aunt and uncle live in Joplin, Missouri, which a few years ago had a major tornado.
Yeah.
And my uncle told me that it was the weirdest thing to be driving and have no idea where you are.
Yeah.
Because literally every landmark, every tree, every building, everything is just rubble. It's just flattened. There's no street signs. There's no anything. And he said it's surreal to have that sort of devastation and destruction.
Yeah, your brain doesn't know how to take it in. It's just like this doesn't register.
Do you remember where you were when the tornado hit?
I was at home. We were with my other brothers and sisters and Mom. Dad was downtown. No, one of my sisters was not there. He was downtown to pick her up for some kind of dance lesson or something that she had. And my mom was looking out the front window of the house, looking, I guess that would be, I don't know what direction that would be. South, I guess. And she says, there is some kind of weird cloud heading our way. Get under the bed, she yelled. Had us all get under a bed. Not how good that's going to do.
Yeah.
And that thing went right over our house, but it must have lifted up and then gone over, and then touched down as it went over. And it does sound like a train, like they say.
Really?
Yeah. And as it got onto the other side, there was a highway, an expressway that ran behind our house, and and then there was the high school football field on the other side of that. It touched down there, and then I was able to get up and look out the back window long enough to see those huge lights that they have on the football field.
On the football field.
Just bend right before my eyes
Wow.
like that. And the funnel shape was, at first it was not a funnel shape, it was just a big black cloud. But by that time it had become a clear funnel shape, and it was kind of winding its way right through the high school field and then went on downtown from there. So it lifted over our house and missed our house.
So it missed your house, but touched down right behind
the house.
Destroyed everything.
Yeah.
Wow,
And
that's
destroyed completely flattened another house just two houses down from us.
Yeah.
Wow. Like when you saw that happen, like did it make you think of God at all in that way?
Not at that time.
That's what's interesting to me. I would have thought,
The fact that it skipped over my house, I'm like, wow. Like,
Not at that time. It was just like,
wow.
It was, like, wow, what was that?
Yeah.
And how many years before was that before you started attending the first church?
Trying to remember. Actually, I think my conversion was after that.
Right.
It was after that.
And so you said it was 74 when the
74, so it
tornado
was
hit.
76 thereabouts. Yeah.
So it took several years, it sounds like, for the recovery to happen
Yeah.
afterwards. And you mentioned that church you went to, was it
Xenia First Church of Christ.
Xenia First Church of Christ.
Mm-hmm.
Xenia, Ohio is the town.
Mm-hmm.
Became kind of this hub because it was one of the only church buildings that
Right, that
survived.
was not destroyed, yeah.
What kinds of things were they doing? How did it, what kind of hub was it?
I'm not sure because I wasn't in the church yet at that time.
Right.
But I think they were whatever churches. I heard later that they were very involved in serving the community. So I'm not sure about all the stuff that they were doing.
Right.
But so when I got there, by the time I got there, I think that this is just my theory.
Yeah.
But I think that process of opening up to the community transformed that church. Whatever it was, when I got there, I felt like that church was on fire. I mean, there were some things happening, and the thing that I would pinpoint as the characteristic of an on-fire church is that they're doing something significant. And by that I mean it's not just the ho-hum, everything is normal. They're actually doing something that's going to change society. This is significant what they're doing. And I had that feeling in addition to the just the love that they have there, as I mentioned. But I had that feeling that this is something, I don't know if I'm saying it right. I'm not sure I'm explaining it right, but when I say the word significant, I mean it's something that is making a genuine impact. It's going to change the world in some way, change the society in some way.
So
does that make sense?
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting how those tragedies and challenges can really bring people together in a certain way and help them realize what's important. And like you said, it seemed like this church was. I don't know what they were like before. Obviously, you don't either. But
I don't either.
The impression you got was definitely that they had really kind of formed this really strong community through that time by opening themselves up to the neighborhood, opening themselves up to the community, and kind of breaking out of just their usual routines to do something that
you didn't get the feeling that this was just business as usual.
Right.
It was unique and they I forget, I was going to say something else. As you were talking, I had another idea in mind, but the little bird flew away.
Did you have like any specific moments or specific encounters with people at that church that made you realize that this is where I want to be? Like, this is a life-changing moment that I want to be in?
Yeah. Well, the preacher at that time made a huge impact on me. His preaching was amazing. But the youth minister also, Don Toy, he's gone on to be with the Lord now. And
you mentioned that you lived with him for a little bit, right?
Actually, because my dad's factory where he worked was completely wiped out. And they went back and forth. This Kroller Manufacturing, they make furniture. And they went back and forth as to whether they were going to rebuild or not. And finally, they decided they weren't going to. They couldn't. It wasn't worth it to them. So he relocated down in Charlotte, North Carolina. I was in my senior year when the tornado hit.
Right.
And so they were getting ready to finish my year. This was in the halfway point through the year. And they were going to finish that year during that summer in summer school in Beaver Creek, another town. Many more schools. And so I didn't want to mess that up. I was pretty independent from my mom and dad anyway by that time. And so I wanted to stay in Xenia and finish that out. And then Don Toy and his family offered that I could live with them. So we did. Dad moved on down to North Carolina. And I stayed with Don Toy and his family. And it was, you have to know Don. He is such, the word that describes this man was encourager. He was an encourager. He was constantly building up, discipling others. He lived the life of a servant leader, that's for sure. And we would discuss issues that were going on at the church. He just taught me every single day. And he even helped me to make my decision for a wife, because I brought Don home to his house one day, and she's outside talking to his wife, to Don's wife. I have two Dawns now. There's Dawn Toy, and then there's Dawn, my wife. Anyway, and he called me Greggy. He says, Greggy, I'd grab onto that one if I was you.
And you're like, sounds good to me. I intend to.
Like, apart from the fact that we have the same name.
I'll never forget that.
And so I love that part of the story too. Personally, I feel like we're so private in our culture sometimes. That the idea, I know other people who would maybe hear that story and be like, he opened up his house and let this random teenager come live there.
Yep, he did.
But it sounds like that was instrumental in your life. You know, he really took you under your wing, literally took you into his house. You guys talked every day.
And they also had another guy there, Dale Holzbauer. Dale Holzbauer, he made a huge impact on me as well, as he does everybody he runs into. And his thing is the way he could combine humor with serious Christian thought was just amazing to me, and continues to be. Dale was a huge inspiration for me as well.
That makes sense. One thing I've always loved about you is you're very intelligent, very wise, very smart, but you also understand there needs to be room for a sense of humor. We got to be able to be funny. We got to be able to be silly. Yeah. So it sounds like that combination was helpful, you know.
Part of my upbringing as a Christian, for sure.
Don't let people be too uptight. So did you feel, because it sounds like this church was incredibly welcoming, did you ever feel any sort of judgment from any of the people, you know?
No,
your name had been in the paper. They knew you.
Wow.
But you had been involved in.
I think to the contrary. I look back at that, and I think they felt like this was like a confirmation for them that their Christianity is working, because you know, people are being transformed, and that's when you can say, "Hey, our Christianity, this thing that we're doing here at church, this is real."
Yeah.
So I guess I wonder, because it seems like you didn't really come from a Christian background, but then you ended up getting saved. So did you getting saved ended up becoming like some sort of salvation for your parents, like when they saw you go through that?
Yes, as a matter of fact, it wasn't automatic. The elders had a program that they were doing at the church where they would go around, the 2 by 2 of the elders would work together, and they would look for homes that they could visit, and then they would try to get a Bible study started in the homes. And they did that with us. And I remember it was the Gospel of John, and so they worked with my mom and dad and through the Gospel of John, and they started coming to church, and they were baptized.
That's awesome.
Yeah, I think just getting the word out in front of people and sitting down across the table, that to me is the most exciting thing you can possibly do. That's so much more exciting. To me, that's much more exciting than sitting in church. And I'm not saying anything against church.
No, because I mean, the church is not even the building, it's just the people. So as long as you have the people, you're having church. So.
And so
it kind of reminds me of another story. I have my uncle Terry. I was taking a course at Cincinnati Bible College in evangelism, and one of the things that we had to do for that course was to develop our own presentation of how we would present the gospel to somebody. And then we were supposed to actually go out and do it, and then come back and report on that in class, okay? So I did the presentation. I had a really nice little presentation, but I didn't go out and do it on anybody.
Yeah. You didn't try it out.
Then I remembered, another student called me and says, Greg, did you go out and do your thing? We got to do a report tomorrow. I said, no, I haven't done anything. So I called my uncle and I said, can we come out and visit you? And he lives out in the country, right? And so he said, okay. And so my friend, other classmate, the two of us went out to visit my uncle. And we sat around the table just like this.
Your uncle wasn't a Christian?
No.
Yeah.
There was his wife and one of his kids was there. And I went through the whole thing on the table and then I laid my pencil down and I said, what do you think? And he says, Greg, how long have you been into this? And I said, about a couple of years now. And he says, and you're just now telling me about it? This is amazing, he said. You mean I could be baptized tonight if I wanted? Absolutely. I went out and baptized him that very night.
Wait, you baptized?
In the pond, out back.
It's just something you were doing for a class assignment.
He became the elder of the church later on.
It's like that's the A+ right there. Like I not only like preach the gospel, but I baptize.
Yeah. That's one heck of a report to give the next day in class.
I mean, it just shows you that you can't prejudge. We got to get the word out because it's powerful, and if the right person is there at the right time and God's preparing those people, we don't know that. You never know.
I love that.
Yeah.
The mega church I interned at in Florida was called Real Life Christian Church, and that was one of the biggest lessons I got from one of the pastors there. And he was telling me one of the biggest issues he sees a lot of churches, because Real Life was doing great at. They averaged about 2 baptisms every Sunday for 2 years straight. So, over 100 people for 2 years straight that, 100, 200 people had been baptized. And it was just consistent. It was just every Sunday there was somebody else coming forward to be baptized. And I was talking to him, asking him about what was the difference, because this pastor, he had pastored at another church for like 5 years that had maybe 2 baptisms in the 5 years.
Yeah.
And this church was having 2 baptisms every Sunday. And he said, I think we just ask. He said, that's the biggest difference. He's like, we just give them the opportunity to make the decision.
Yeah.
They never had it at his previous church.
In sales, they call that closing the deal, and that's where most bad salesmen, that's where they err. They don't close the deal by simply asking them to make that decision.
Yeah, that reminds me of, I know when we went to our church one night for Bible study, and my pastor ended up doing like an impromptu teaching, and he got into the subject of wealth. And I know one of the things he talked about was, the wealth of the wicked being laid up for the righteous. And what he used was like an example of someone that he knew who was preaching the gospel to somebody who was not a Christian. And that person ended up, basically buying him a car in exchange for the gift that he gave him, because he felt like that what he was getting was more valuable than the money that he spent. And so it's the idea that the gospel that we have is more valuable than wealth. And so even if somebody wealthy, even though they have all that money, there's something that they're missing if they don't have Christ. And when you give that to them and they accept it, they view it as more valuable than money.
Yeah.
So it's like...
That's
like
the parable of the...
Pearl of...
Great price.
Of Great Price was called.
Yeah. A few weeks ago here at Mid-South Christian College, we had a guy come to speak in chapel, Tom Weaver, and he talked about the idea that every time you present the gospel, whether it be in a sermon or on the street, or every time you present, you have to ask the question, now what are you going to do about it? Because if you don't present them with the choice, they may never do anything. Like you just said about like the idea of closing the deal, we oftentimes never do that.
Yeah,
and so
do.
they're just like, great, now I've got this information, what I do with it. And they're not as clear about what to do with that after it.
Yeah, we lay all the groundwork, but we don't close the deal. And so I love that story because, you were fulfilling a class assignment.
Yeah, that's the thing.
Yeah.
God surprised me. He said, you think you're going to just do this to get by with just getting this done to get your grade? I'm going to show you what can happen when you actually do this.
I love that.
And so I want to get into that part of your life a little bit. You said your youth minister, Don, encouraged you to go into Bible college. You eventually ended up on the mission field. Is that what you went into Bible college thinking you were going to be doing?
No, I had no idea. I probably knew I'd be a preacher, and I had a small church. My first church was a small rural church. I love those people to death. I'm sure if I went back there today, it would be very different because I was young and, stupid.
Yeah.
In a lot of ways. But I knew that wasn't for me because, just trying to maintain a tradition that had who knows, maybe hundreds of years. I don't know how long that church had been there.
Yeah.
But there were certain ways you had to do things and there was no changing that. And I just felt like that wasn't for me. I came to that conclusion. And then about that same time that I came to that conclusion, I hear somebody talking about a group that's being prepared to go to Uruguay, and we need more to be on this team. And so I said, that kind of rung a bell for me. That sounded exciting to me. And I knew immediately that I had to go. I had to do that.
And how old were you when you went?
22.
And you were married already at this point?
Married already, had one child already.
Okay.
And one on the way.
So what was that?
One in the oven.
What was that conversation like with Don? You had the kid, you have one on the way. And you say, I think we need to go to cross the world.
It took a little bit of convincing, but
wow.
But she was yeah. I just look back at that and amazed that she followed my leadership on that. Just absolutely amazing, because she was not so convinced at first. But she was convinced that if God is leading her husband to do something, she needs to go with him, and be there.
That's great.
That's a good point.
And so you felt, as soon as you heard about it, you felt for sure that you needed to go.
Yeah, it was
Had you heard of
somebody
the country?
asked me once, how can you be sure? And my answer was, Jesus said, go and make disciples of all the nations. That was my answer.
That was your answer. Yeah. How can you be sure you're not supposed to go? And so, had you heard of Uruguay before that point?
I'd never heard of it.
Never heard of the country or anything. So,
this sounds a little bit, I don't know. I'm not really big into dreams and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Anybody who knows me knows that I'm not sitting around talking about dreams and visions and stuff. But I did have a dream about Uruguay. Actually, in my mind, in this dream, I saw the port area, and it's kind of weird. I don't talk like that very often.
Yeah.
Wow. See, I'm the complete opposite. I feel like that every dream has a meaning for something, because I've literally had dreams and then I would have it happen later on. Like I would dream about having a certain encounter with maybe somebody that I know or don't know yet, and then it would happen later on, like after it happened. So that's why I try to make a point if I have a dream to record it, and then because a lot of that stuff ended up happening and I didn't realize it did, and I was like, oh, I dreamed about that before it did.
So this was one of those situations where before you had ever gone, you never heard of the country, anything. You dreamed of the port that you ended up showing up at. So,
and that doesn't happen with me very often. I don't depend on dreams. I don't believe in depending on dreams. I think we need to read the Word first and above all things.
And so, did you go first to Uruguay, or you went first to language school, correct?
Yeah, we spent a year in language school in Costa Rica,
learning Spanish.
We did their whole year's program. Dawn wasn't able to do the whole program because then the baby came. Right. Was born in Costa Rica, and that was kind of interesting because she started having labor pains about 2 a.m, and I had to rush out and grab this taxi, and he's barreling down towards the hospital. And then he gets pulled over by the police, and he says, "I got a lady in here. She's about to have a baby." He says, the cop goes, "Okay, go ahead." I didn't speak Spanish, but I understand that's what he was saying. And then the guy afterwards says, "You guys saved my life."
Would have been a huge ticket there. So, which daughter was it?
That was Leah.
That was Leah. She was born in Costa Rica.
She was born in Costa Rica.
I didn't realize that.
Yep.
So, you finish up language school. And you head on to Uruguay. Your
dad had already been there a year.
Okay, that was my question. Was there the other team was already there?
Yeah.
Or was it just my dad? Who else was there?
Who else was on? I think Paul Rowland was on there, and I can't remember who else was on that original team. Yeah.
So there was a few people there.
A few people there already.
Did you guys show up with anybody else, or
no? Just us.
It was just y'all when you came.
When we came, yeah.
What was your first experience when you're on the mission field? I've heard culture shock's a big thing. Did you feel that a little bit?
Well, one of the things that I felt going from Costa Rica to Uruguay was, what in the world is going on? I thought I understood Spanish. I mean, I was talking Spanish back in Costa Rica by that end of that year. I get to Uruguay and I can't understand anybody.
You realize just how different the different dialects of Spanish are.
Their dialect it just sounded so different, and they mumbled more, it seemed like. But after about a couple months, I got reacquainted with, used to how they did it.
What was your lifestyle like there? Like, I mean, outside of doing the mission trips, like, where you all lived and the food that you ate, stuff like that?
They have great meat.
Great meat.
Oh my goodness. You cannot buy, both in Uruguay and Argentina, the meat.
I always tell people the population in Uruguay, there's 3 cows for every 1 person. There's about 3 million people in the country and 9 million cows. So
there's a story about that. I read the history about that, and they say that, at least this historian said, that when they first came across to colonize that area, the soldiers, I guess they were all soldiers at that time in that group, they forgot to bring fruits and vegetables, and all they brought were the cows. Somebody forgot to bring fruits and vegetables. And so when they got there, they lived a lot off the meat.
Yeah.
And then also their fort got burnt down like 3 times by the locals. And so they gave up on the whole project and went off to Peru. And then, but years later they came back, and there went my glasses. They looked off in the distance and they said, I don't remember that mountain being here. And somebody said, that's not a mountain. Those are cows. There's this vast number of cows that just reproduced on
all
their
the
own.
cows they had just left and
that
moved
they
on.
left behind earlier.
And so it's a staple food there.
It's a
in
staple
Uruguay.
food,
I'm
yeah.
sure that was something you enjoyed. And you said you eventually started to understand the people a little bit more and get to know the culture and stuff like that. What did you enjoy about the Uruguayan culture and society and all?
Can I put them together with the Argentine culture?
Absolutely, sure.
I love the way they enjoy their food, and it's so amazing. It is an art. Let's put it that way. And you'll see them come to work on Monday. And the reason I know that because we had a gymnasium in Argentina for a while that we were working with, and so we'd see these guys come in on Monday, and they would talk for an hour or more about the cookout that they did on Saturday.
On that weekend, yeah.
And just go on and on and on about how they applied the salt and which wine they chose, and so on. It was just amazing. But the way they could enjoy simple things like that, I like that. I love the fact that you knew everybody on your block where you lived. You knew the butcher down the road. You knew the guy who has the little grocery store in front, the one that has the bread store on the corner, and then the little everything store on the other corner. Everybody knew each other, and you could walk on the streets, and you'd stand there and have a conversation with people. I really miss that here in the United States. We're just so isolated here.
Yeah. We're an individualistic society.
Yeah.
But is there anything in I guess, let me figure out how to ask this. Was there any customs, because I know that, even though you were living over there, you were born and raised here, but is there any customs that you brought over there that just weren't acceptable that you found out later on? Or
Yeah, I'm sure. I'm sure there was a lot.
Any dumb American things you were doing that they were like?
There was a lot. Nothing comes to my mind right now.
Well, I do like that point you were making earlier about, because my dad said the same thing about Uruguay. That we've talked a lot, me and him, about how there's something very spiritual about sharing a meal together that happens with around food, and his concern is that sometimes in the United States, for us, eating is just something you have to do to survive. It's fast food. It's whatever's the most
get it over with as
efficient,
quickly as possible.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Whereas he said in Uruguay, they didn't start dinner till 7 or 8 o'clock at night, and it was going to go on till midnight or later. It was an event all evening long, and he really did feel that those long meals, those slow meals, this time to really hang out with people, contributed a lot to the environment.
Well, when they have a meeting, for example, they've planned a meeting. It could be a church meeting or a meeting of a board, whatever. The first thing that they'll spend at least a minimum of half an hour just talking about anything, about their whatever, nothing to do with the business at hand. And you're like, I thought we were going to talk about when are we going to get to the point? That's one area where I had to learn to be more patient, and because I realized that what they're doing is they're establishing a rapport so that then when they do the business, they can get it done more easily. It's very smart, actually. But that's the way they did it.
It wasn't straight to business. It was
not straight to business. You spend at least a half an hour just talking about whatever.
So it was a slower way of life.
Yeah, our fast American lifestyle does not accommodate that.
So you were in Uruguay for a little bit. You lumped together Uruguay and Argentina culture there a little bit. I'm sure the Uruguayans and Argentines we know would be very upset if
they're probably the closest of.
They are. I agree.
Culturally.
I just know Uruguayans and Argentines hate to be compared to each other, even though they're basically the same in my experience.
Yeah. I'd say Uruguay's probably more political oriented.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Lot more activism.
More.
They're the ones that elected a communist president
Right,
recently and
right.
things like that. And so eventually, though, you made the decision to leave Uruguay and go across the border
Right.
to Argentina specifically.
Yeah.
Why did you make that decision? And if I understand correctly, did you kind of go out on your own to Argentina?
Yeah. I'm not real certain that my way of doing this. I'm pretty certain that I didn't have a good attitude at the time. It seemed like I was always in conflict with the rest of the team.
Yeah.
And about some certain things.
Because there was a whole team of missionaries that were there.
A whole team of missionaries.
And you felt like you were always butting heads with them.
Always button heads.
So you moved over to Argentina. What was your, you're kind of on your own at this point now. What was the game plan for you? What were you thinking?
Well, Jorge was working with me, so I wasn't completely on my own. First thing we did was we traveled throughout the whole province of Buenos Aires. Buenos Aires is a city, but it's also a province.
Okay. That's the capital city.
That's the capital city.
But it's also
La Plata is the capital.
Oh, really?
People don't know that, but
I always thought as soon as Buenos Aires.
Yeah, La Plata is the capital. And so we were, me and your grandpa and your uncle David.
Yeah,
the three of us. We traveled throughout all of the province of Buenos Aires, all these different little towns, Pigüé, places I'd never heard of. And we had a tent. Mm-hmm. And so we'd make a tent in different places and set it up and then go and just like spy out the land, so to speak, see what it's like and try to decide if there's a place that we felt like God was calling us to plant a church. There was a couple places that one of them was called Azul, a town called Azul. And, I don't know why we ended up not going there. We ended up coming back to Buenos Aires.
You say a tent. Were you guys like just camping out?
Camping out at all these different places rather than,
Yeah.
Yeah. And one night we put up this tent. It was really late and we were getting tired. We'd driven for quite a while and it was dark. This road just kept going on and on and on. You have to know what the Patagonia is like. It's just flat and just goes on and on. And, so we said, there's a little road. Let's pull off here and just set up our tent for the night. Set up our tent and ate our meal and went to bed. And then about 3 a.m, we hear this loud noise and this light right at the tent. We'd set it up right next to a train track. Oh. Didn't even realize it.
You're suddenly hearing a train all over again. Flashbacks to the tornado.
It was pitch black out, so we didn't see that train track.
Yeah. Oh, wow. And so you traveled around. You tried to find a place. You did end up settling on Buenos Aires.
Well, actually, a neighborhood of Buenos Aires, which would be Florencio Varela, which is the southernmost barrio of Greater Buenos Aires.
And so was the plan was to kind of try to start a church there and
actually we were going to work with a missionary who was already there. Roger Quarton was already there, and so work with him, and we did for quite a number of years, and he eventually came back to the States and we stayed on.
So how many years did you end up spending in Argentina specifically?
Well, we were in Uruguay from 83 to 90, and then 90 to 2004 in Argentina.
So it was like 14 years. Mm-hmm. So 2004 comes around and you are moving back to the States. Was that the plan? What kind of inspired that?
There's a lot of things that went into that. Mm-hmm. Sometimes you look for one cause of things, and it's actually multiple causes. One of the things was our kids were back here in college, and another thing was it just hit me at one point that that you could stay forever as a missionary in a location. And our original intent, what we actually said to the people when we were raising funds, was that this was not going to be a forever thing. We were going to go plant a church and move on, because we believe that that's what that's the process that should take place.
Right.
And I still believe that.
You leave and you raise up local leaders who can take over the work.
Problem was that when you're working in a poor neighborhood like we were, you get into a situation that you can't get out of. And Argentines, they don't see the pastor as somebody who's going to go on. They see them as somebody who's going to be with them forever.
Yeah.
It's kind of he's their leader. And then I didn't know that going into it, you know. But once you're into that role, you can't hardly get out. And it's hard to explain because it's very cultural.
Right.
It has to do with the Argentine, just the general Latin American view of what a leader is,
right,
and so forth, and the very kinds of activities that I would have to do to foster empowerment in others are the things that they would interpret as not being a very good leader.
Yeah.
if that makes sense.
I have some insight into this because I, as somebody who's grown up in a little bit of both cultures, I've seen that a little bit. Because there is, it's a more hierarchical society, and
they call it power distance. There's a term for it in sociology, I guess that is. Right. The more power distance it means that the more that that society accepts as normal and preferable to have certain people that have more power than others.
Right. Our society is very egalitarian. Everybody's the same. We hate when somebody's like, well, who made you the boss? What do you get to say? Whereas their culture is not so much. I saw this a few years ago. It's similar in Spain, is what I've heard. Spanish culture in Spain.
Probably more so.
And I'm curious if that is where some of that influence came from. But the Memphis Grizzlies basketball team here had a Spanish player, famous player, Marc Gasol, and he was best player on the team. The Grizzlies hired a new coach named David Fizdale, who came over from the Miami Heat. And Fizdale was known as a player empowerment coach. He was like, my job as the coach is not to tell you what to do. I want the stars of the team to run the team. I want the stars to be the ones calling the plays. I want the team to work together. And his goal was to empower each of the players to have say in the team. Marc Gasol hated it, and he had all these interviews he was doing with Spanish newspapers talking about how terrible this coach is and how he doesn't even want to coach. He's just trying to get me to do all his work for him and all this kind of stuff. And meanwhile, the American players loved David Fizdale. They were like, he's finally letting us do what we want to do. We're not just cogs in the machine. We get to make our own decisions. And it was so interesting to see. The American players felt great with that empowerment. The Spanish player, Marc Gasol, felt like this coach was slacking on his duties, shirking off his duties, and putting them all on him. He's like, you're the coach. You call the plays. Tell me what to do.
Isn't that hilarious?
And so
such a difference.
Yeah, I guess it kind of sounds like, I guess the Americans want to lead themselves, whether certain, I guess, people from other countries don't mind being led by other people.
Right.
That's exactly it.
And so you went in with this idea of we're going to empower the locals to take over.
Be democratic, be empowering, etc.
And they didn't want that.
It's like, don't make me think. Just tell me what to do.
Just let me stay and tell me what to do.
You're the leader. Tell me what to do.
And so did you feel, eventually I guess you felt like you just maybe had to rip the Band-Aid off?
Yeah, exactly. That's It's a good way to put it. I just felt like you could be here forever.
Yeah.
Now, there is another work that we started. Actually, we had less to do with it than anything. Is in northern Argentina. We were actually helping with another church. They were doing it was kind of like a social service type of thing. They were going up there to help out with an orphanage, put on a new roof of an orphanage, help out with a local school. We did several things. We went 3 trips with them.
Yeah.
And at one point, the people themselves came to us, leaders. It was myself and the preacher of the main church that was doing this, and said, we want to start a church like you guys have a church. And is that possible? Can you believe that?
Is that possible?
Yeah. And so the preacher of this church, which was an English-speaking church, by the way, in Buenos Aires, he looks at me and says, Greg, that sounds more like down your line. I said, yeah, it does. And so we said, we would like for y'all to really think about this because starting a church is serious. And so he and I went off and asked them to discuss this together and make sure that this is what they want to do. And then we came back later, and they said, "Yeah, we want to do it." They'd already picked out their pastor.
Wow.
One of the guys in their group apparently knew a lot about the Bible and had a lot of respect amongst them. I said, "Great." So I would go out every 2 months, travel all the way out there. It's about a 1,700-mile trip.
Wow.
I think I might have that wrong because I get kilometers and miles mixed up. But it was a bus trip, and it was a plane trip, and then a bus trip.
Wow. And so you would go every 2 months to just kind of
2 or 3, 4 months and mix and meet just with him and take materials and work with him, find out what kind of problems he's run into, help him work out, things, possible strategies for. In other words, I was never the leader of that church.
Right.
I was never viewed as the pastor. In fact, we had one group from the States come down and to help us out with a project up there.
Yeah.
And he had saved up several baptisms to do while the team was there.
Yeah.
And he wanted me to do it. And I said, no, you do it.
Yeah.
I did not want to get into that position again of being viewed as the leader.
Right.
I was only discipling him. And I would say that church has been the most successful of all the churches that we started.
Yeah.
So,
because
the one I had least to do
the one you
with.
had the least to do it.
So during that process of starting a church, what did you learn about the difficulties and the positives about starting a church?
Oh my! Well, I learned that escaping from tradition is you never escape from. They have their own traditions. As well.
You thought I'm getting away from all this traditional Christianity stuff. I'm going to the mission field. They had their own traditions.
Yeah. I also learned that you have to be very careful. A missionary has to be very careful about only appealing to the extremely poor because once your church gets that reputation, that's all the people that will go there.
Oh, really?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. There's a strong sense. We had people, even though where we were working was one of the poorest barrios of all Buenos Aires. It should be Buenos Aires, but I'll say Buenos Aires just because we're in English. That even so, it was even though it was one of the most poorest areas, there were people in our neighborhood who had cars, some kind of car, not anything fancy, but they would have a car, and they would have a house that was at least finished.
Yeah.
But those people wouldn't come to our church because we started out with this extremely poor, and that's the only thing we did, and we got stuck into that position. And so what that does is that makes your leadership material a little more difficult to find.
Yeah. It is interesting how no matter what society, no matter what culture, no matter what part of the world you're in, people always find dividing lines to draw.
Oh yeah.
So it's like, well, I'm poor, but I'm not. I have a finished house. I'm not as poor as that person. I have a car. And there's always some dividing line to draw, and it is interesting how those lines can sometimes hinder the work we're doing.
Later on, we went and we actually purchased a building in the center of town, a whole different class of people.
Yeah.
Okay, started going there and appealing to a whole different class of people. And the people from the other church wouldn't come to this church.
Oh my goodness.
They
So
wouldn't.
was it their mindset that
So it's not just the wealthy who are being prejudiced against the poor, but the poor were actually prejudiced against the wealthy.
Oh, okay.
Wow.
So was it that they didn't want to be in the same building with one another, or they didn't want to commune with one another? Is that the issue, or was it
It's
just the
that
fact
they were
that
just uncomfortable. They were uncomfortable, I think, probably more than anything. It wasn't
didn't
like they
wanna
set out and say, "I hate these people." It was more like they just didn't feel comfortable.
So you learned all these lessons on the mission field. You decide, got to rip the Band-Aid off. It's time to come back to the States. I've heard you talk before about some things I've just heard other missionaries talk before about this kind of secondary culture shock they feel, where they feel like a foreigner in their own country when they come back. And I've heard it especially when it comes from missionaries as it relates to the church. So what are some lessons you think you learned maybe from your life in Xenia and also the church you were a part of there, your Bible college years, and then in the mission field as well, that you think we should be a little bit better about applying in the American church.
For the
and
church.
maybe specifically here at Wayfarers for those listening.
Well, what you said about the reverse culture shock, it was worse than the original culture shock for me.
Really?
You have to understand that there's a term, I can't remember what it is right now, that cultural anthropologists use. I think I had actually adopted the Argentine culture. I just swallowed it, hook, line, and sinker, so to speak.
You were a local at this point now.
Yeah. One time,
culturally,
this guy, my wife and I were shopping in a store, and this guy pulls me aside and he says, "Hey," they say "che." Yeah. Che means hey.
Yeah.
Che, how did you go about getting an American to get married to?
he thought this guy's an Argentine. He married an American. How'd you figure that out? What's the secret?
What's the secret?
That's funny.
Anyway,
so you felt an increased culture shock when you came back. To the
more.
States.
It was more. It took me years to overcome that.
And so, was that kind of communal nature of Argentina?
That was
of
part
the church
of it.
there? Is that
yeah.
something you felt like you missed?
Yeah,
you could ideally see here and in the church, especially.
I think just the way we're so isolated here, like we were talking about earlier, that was huge. Miss being able to get out and walk the streets and talk to neighbors every other house, or if you want to talk to a neighbor, you go up and you don't knock on the door. You clap and they come out and say, "How you doing? Just want to see how you're doing." They'll invite you in. I just miss all of that.
Yeah.
The other day I've tried to do it several times. Cross the street, knock on the door, and somebody peeks out, closes it real quick, and they never answer the door.
I feel like that's something I would do, but now hearing you say it makes it. Hearing you say that makes it sound so bad, but I feel like I would do that. I feel like I don't know who that is. I'm like,
yeah, and so that environment of being able to be not just an individual but a part of a greater whole is something that you missed out on. So that's a good challenge maybe here for us to end on.
How can we do that?
How can we do that? I don't know that we have figured it out necessarily, but we obviously see the importance of it. You got to experience it personally and really see how life-giving it can be to live in that sort of a culture. And so that can be something to leave us on, maybe something for those listening and watching to think about. I want to thank everybody who decided to tune in. Thank you, Greg, for sharing a little bit about your story. I know you've got a lot of great stories we weren't able to get into yet that you've shared with me before. So especially for those members at Wayfarers, maybe next time you see Greg on a Sunday, you should come up to him and let him know you appreciate him coming on and sharing a little bit about his story, and maybe he can share a few of the other funny stories he's got from his experience. But other than that, I would look forward to seeing any of you on Sunday for our Sunday service. This Sunday, we've got a worship night. It's going to be a night focused all on worship and on musical singing. I think Jacob and Joey prepared a special element that's going to be coming up, right?
Yeah, so I sat down with our worship leader, Joseph, and we're trying to come up with a spoken word that we're writing together. So come on out and hear us.
If you're listening to this before Sunday, come hang out with us this Sunday. I think you'll really enjoy it. Or otherwise, we hope to see you on the next week's Deep Dive. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.